Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Saïd Business School and to our next Engaging with the Humanities lunchtime talk. It's very nice to see familiar faces and new faces. I hope you're all enjoying the carb-intensive lunch we've provided for you. Please feel free to keep getting up and sampling more and have coffee and tea as we go along. This is meant to be informal and relaxed and, of course, enjoyable. My name is Pegram Harrison. I'm a lecturer here in the business school, and one of my joys as well as responsibilities is to help the business school integrate better with the humanities division of the university. And we do that in various ways through teaching and research and also public events, public engagement, such as this series of lunchtime talks, where what we do is we bring people from the humanities to do their stuff in our building. That's about the brief. And I'm very fortunate in having the time to meet with lots of colleagues all over the Humanities Division and ask them to come tell us about their work here to audiences that they don't necessarily normally interact with. So thank you for playing your part in creating opportunities for interdisciplinary activity in this university. Now, some of you will have been to earlier events. We've looked at music, we've looked at the classics, and now we advertised that we would be asking a question, why bother to look at art? But consistent with his intellectual makeup, our speaker today has made a last-minute swerve of a very interesting sort.
When he says intellectual makeup, what he means is incapacity to focus.
Well, which may be something of a topic, but the point of the change is that a lot of what Jim Harris' work involves as an art historian and a curator and a teacher is objects as well as images, and so it's important to think about art in the very broadest sense. And also looking in the very broadest sense. So we're looking in the round, looking in many dimensions, and thinking about objects and things as art or as well as art is part of the challenge, not just for curators and historians and people engaged with art, but indeed for all of us who live in a world of things. So with that mild provocation, I will say only one more thing, which is that Jim is part of a team of people from the Ashmolean who have a similar mission to our endeavor here in engaging more broadly with the university and the public. He's part of a team of teaching curators. He's now the lead teaching curator whose job is to go throughout the university and find people willing and interested in teaching their discipline, whether it be classics or biology or business, using the incredible, unparalleled, rich resources of the Ashmolean. So he's quite practiced at this type of intermediating activity, and it is my pleasure to welcome him here today. Please join me in welcoming Jim Harris.
Thank you. How are you doing? Pegram, you're very kind, thank you. And it's a pleasure to see you all, so many of you. Alarmingly many of you. But that's fine, that's fine. As Pegram says, my profession and my current job are not exactly the same thing. That is to say, my profession is that of an art historian. I am a specialist in late medieval and early Renaissance sculpture. I work on Donatello and Ghiberti in Florence, on André Bonneveau in Burgundy in France, and the principal aim of my personal scholarship, if you like, is to understand how people did things, why they did them with the things that they did, so the materials they used, and the ways in which the objects which we encounter now in museums or in art galleries or in the street where sculpture is public are in some way different from the objects that were originally made. That is to say, I seek to understand their journey across time, the way in which they've become the things we now see, and the way in which that change operates on us to make our view of things different. My job at the Ashmolean is not quite the same, but involves many of the same activities. my role in discovering ways that the collections of the museum can be used in the teaching of the university involves me persuading people to look. Persuading people to come to the museum, not so they can wander vaguely through the Italian Renaissance gallery, take a right, find themselves bewilderingly amongst Dutch paintings, and then carry on suddenly to be surrounded by violins, but rather to make them stop in front of the individual object. Or in the study room, confronted by an object out of its case, without the mediation of either glass or label, to examine it as carefully as they can in order to determine what they can know from it. Because the question of what you can know from an object depends not on what somebody in a curatorial capacity has written on a label, nor what is present in a guidebook, but on the question that you ask. And the questions that people ask of objects vary according to their disciplines. A geographer will ask a different question of a piece of sculpture from a historian. A linguist will ask a different question of a painting from somebody whose background is in literature. These kinds of varieties of interrogation, these different aspects of inquiry are what fascinate me when students and their teachers come to the museum, because I don't know what they will ask. And my role is not to tell them what to ask, but to teach them how to look, because it's only by looking that the questions will present themselves. So when I come to this question, what's the point of looking at things? My first answer would be to say the point of looking at things is to know what question to ask of the object, to know what it is that you want to know. Because not all objects present themselves as straightforwardly as others. This is the Weld Blundell Prism, also known thrillingly as the Sumerian King List. Now, statistics tell me that no one in this room reads ancient Sumerian. Tell me I'm wrong. So, what we have here is an impenetrably, painfully obscure thing. You can see that it's broken, you can see that it's damaged, you can see that it's covered with marks, but we have no idea what they are. This is the experience of many people coming to a museum, even undergraduates in this exalted institution and their teachers, confronted not simply by objects as complex as this, but by any object, because the business of looking at things is not something which we do with any great rigour. Oxford is a wonderfully, comprehensively and thoroughly philological place. We love books and we love words. We are less comfortable with stuff, and looking at things in museums for many people is like looking at the Weld Blundell Prism. We know that much, but there is no way of getting beyond that. So what I want to think about is, when you look more closely, what kinds of things can you see? What kinds of questions might you ask? What kinds of understanding might you achieve of people's motivation, of processes of making, of subjective differences in quality between things, on the reason why things were made, the function of things, the way in which they tell us something about not only the moment in which they were made, but the lives of the people who made them. The way in which they can tell us something not about the one thing we expect, which is probably in a museum, either art history or archaeology, but about something entirely unrelated. This is an object almost as unpromising on first sight as the Weld Blundell Prism. This is a very typical work by the great sculptor Judd, with whom I'm pretty certain more of you are familiar than are familiar with ancient Sumerian. Judd had a sculptural practice which was extraordinarily rigorous. He had nothing to do with the manufacture of the objects that he produced? Nothing. He wouldn't be in the same building in which these things were being made. This is a copper box. It's made of sheet copper, which is screwed together. The interior has a red base, and what you see of this red at the top is the red base reflected onto the surface of the shiny copper. This is entirely in keeping with Judd's oeuvre generally. He makes objects which have no resonance beyond themselves. He sought to make things which told no story, which related to nothing, which implied nothing, which represented nothing. The specific object, in the words of Michael Fried, the great art historian. But if you look more closely at this, and if you look particularly just here, or if you're on this side of the room, just here. This feels like being a weatherman. You can see something here. Come on, someone tell me, what can you see here? Fingerprints. Fingerprints. Judd hated fingerprints. He absolutely bloody hated them because they spoiled the surface. Because once a fingerprint is on something, you know something that's happened to it. It's not just there, it's been somewhere else. It's not just itself, it's itself plus someone. And this made him very unhappy. It was also the case that fingerprints exercised another of the great minimalist sculptors, Carl André. Carl André, who was once asked if he had anything to say to curators who dealt with his work, and he said, yes, I have 5 words for them: gloves, 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 and gloves. Because he was so conscious that the ruination of a surface meant the ruination of the impact of his work. However, he also made work which is intended to be touched, of which this is an example. Steel zinc plane. A grid of steel alternating with zinc plates, which sits on the floor of Tate. Here's another of those kinds of work, this one, Venus Forge. Now these are supposed to be walked on. So if on the one hand you have some knowledge of Judd and you have some knowledge of André, and you know this thing about sculpture, which is that it's not to be touched, and we're all taught that sculpture is not to be touched. Sculpture, the most wonderfully tactile of all art forms. Sculpture, the thing that you long to caress. Sculpture, the thing that gives itself up in surface, in texture, and in material, is nonetheless the thing we never touch. This is the great tragedy of my profession. The great joy of my profession, of course, is that because I've become a professional, I get to put my hands on all sorts of things that I'm not supposed to. We're all supposed to touch this, but nobody does. What happens is this. Somebody walks into the gallery and they get to the end of Venus Forge and they stand and they look at it. They look at it again. Nobody's standing still, by the way, when they're doing this. Nobody's like this. Because this thing suggests movement to you. People are like this. And then they look around. And they see Pegram in the corner. He's not interested, so they think, oh, okay. And they do that. And they look at Pegram again. He's still not interested. He's a very bad custodian. And then they put a foot down. And then they put the other foot down. And then they stand still. That's the still moment. And then when they're absolutely certain that nobody's watching, they start to walk. And then one of the plates wobbles, because they're not perfectly flat. One of them just rattles a bit, like a floorboard on the landing of a medieval house. This thing just goes clunk, and you go, oh, and then they step off. And then they look to see if anyone's noticed, and then they get back on, and then they walk the length of it. And once they've walked the length of it once, they'll walk back. Because this thing longs to be walked on, but it doesn't tell you that. And it's not every museum that will put a label saying, please walk, or please touch. The looking involved with an object like this involves looking around you, involves looking at your whole environment, involves suddenly being aware not only of the object, but of the room it's in, of the occupants of the room, of the status of this thing in relation to the floor, the realization that it's not perfectly flat, changes your view of this. It stops being a kind of a display in Topps tiles and starts being a made object. Looking carefully at things reveals things about them that we don't expect. With large-scale contemporary and modern abstract sculpture, looking carefully sometimes is a good warning. You look carefully at Richard Serra's trip hammer, you realise that there is nothing holding it up. That this piece of steel is not fixed to the floor, and this piece of steel on top is not fixed to the upright, nor is it fixed to the wall in the corner. This whole thing is standing up because it stands up, because Richard Serra has made it very, very carefully. Looking at this gives you some insight into the kinds of precision that go into the conception and the manufacture of an object. This gives you pause to think about what constitutes simplicity. This gives you pause to think about what constitutes safety in a public space. Because if that were ever to fall down, there would be a terrible crashing, and whoever was underneath it experiencing a terrible crushing. It doesn't happen because it's well made. The question of making is an interesting one. The question of how we come to ideas about making. Again, here's Don Judd with this wall piece in polished copper, which constitutes a kind of box attached to the wall with these projecting semicircular sections. Judd's practice, as I said, was not to make things. His practice was to draw. And this is what Judd's drawings look like. Stack of boxes. Stack of boxes with dividers in them. And here, that thing that you just saw on the wall. Judd's involvement in it is to do this, to make a sketch of its shape, to add to it dimensions, to say what material it should be in, brass, to say what the finish should be, mirror finish, to write that all down on a piece of paper about so big, then to send it off to a manufacturer, who then produces exactly what Judd has written down, has drawn. If you look carefully at that object, it's very hard to tell what its genesis is. But if you go beyond the object and you start looking elsewhere, you start looking at process, at those things that artists leave behind them, the detritus of the studio, then you begin to understand more, not just about that object, but about him, about his process. Judd's rigour in this was legendary. I did some work 5 or 6 years ago with a man who was one of Judd's fabricators, made over 200 works for Judd. He lived 1 block away from Judd in New York. And when he moved in, Judd came to see him. And they had drinks, and it was all very friendly. And for the next 20 years, during which he made these 200 objects, Judd never set foot in this house again. And Peter Ballantyne, the fabricator, once said to Judd, "Why don't you ever come? You know, why don't you come?" And Judd said, "If I come to your house, I will be involved in the making of the object." And actually, the object comes from here to the gallery. It doesn't come via my hand. Now, that might seem perverse to you, but there is power and rigour in Judd's work, just as there is in his process. The question of what tools people use is of interest to me. Not simply because I'm interested in the way things are made, but because I think understanding something about someone's tools tells you something about them. And at the moment, my research is concerned with sculpture and drawing, and the way in which drawing is or is not a tool for a sculptor. Sculptors left far fewer drawings for us to examine than painters did. The Ashmolean is one of the great repositories in the world of drawings. We have the world's largest group of Raphaels. We have the world's 3rd largest group of Michelangelos, although at the moment 26 of them are on show at the Met in New York. Finding sculptors' drawings in there is, well, it's thin pickings compared to painters' drawings. This is an interesting one. This drawing is made by this man, Lambert Sigisbert Adam. Great name. If I didn't like the drawing, I'd still have shown it to you because Lambert Sigisbert Adam is such a great name. He's punishingly obscure 18th century French sculptor in an academic tradition who made colossal fountains, large-scale marble statues. He commanded a great workshop. He was toweringly successful. His work was exported from France all over Europe, and he was in the pay of great magnates. And he was good. I mean, I'm being mean about him, largely owing to the fact that he's slipped from public view because his work is relatively conventional. But he was really good. And he drew this. This is himself, his self-portrait. And it's an interesting drawing to think about. What do we see? We see a man in a window frame. But it's a window frame where he appears to be on the outside because we're looking away from him into a landscape with large-scale sculpture in it. And yet it's a landscape which is populated by this curtain. So he could be inside or he could be outside. It's hard to tell. He tells you who he is, very clearly. He also shows you his work. These are things that he made. So it's a portrait not just of him, but of his practice. And the interesting thing from my point of view is this thing here. Because here is a drawing for sculpture. And we are convinced that sculptors all draw in order to prepare for making a sculpture. Or we're supposed to be convinced of that. Yeah.
So, is it possible to put those lights off that are just near the screen?
Magic.
Yeah,
There you go.
yeah.
I'm decreasingly of a mind to think that sculptors really just churn out lots of drawings in the way that painters do. I mean, they use models, we know that. But it's interesting how Adam here has chosen to use drawing, because what this drawing is a portrait. It's not a working drawing, it's this, which is, as you can see, his personification of hunting, which is now at Sanssouci in Potsdam, near Berlin. What Adam shows us is his work. The way he shows us his work, because he's producing a self-portrait, is to include a portrait of it. Where he shows us his tools is in his hand. He has a mallet and he has chisels. These are his working objects. This is not. This is a way of conveying what he does to you, the viewer. Looking carefully at this drawing then tells us something about him as a sculptor which we don't expect. That is to say, it tells us something about his working practice, about what he values, and about the way in which he wants to convey what he does. Looking at things from odd angles is always a useful thing to do. Looking back at Judd here, this is one of his works. This thing here, which, as you can see, like the Great Wall of China, can be seen from space. It can't actually be seen from space, and neither can the Great Wall of China. But it can be seen from a very long way away. Imaginatively named 15 Untitled Works in Concrete, Don Judd was a great one for untitled and then a title. Let's say, untitled work in millennium, or 75 works in paper. This doesn't really explain itself until you get closer. And you begin to see that this is a series of concrete blocks variously arranged in a line in the landscape. And when you get very close, this is what you see. You get some sense of the scale of the thing, and you get some sense of the massiveness of these blocks. In each case, the arrangement of 6 blocks varies, but the blocks themselves are identical. Now, from this point of view, you can understand something about the work. From this point of view, you can understand something of the work. But from neither point of view can you understand everything about the work. You have to look. You have to look as widely as possible. You have to be prepared not to accept a single image. You have to be prepared not to accept a single angle of view. There are some images with which we're so familiar and whose angle of view is so uniform that they become almost impossible to see. I grew up with images like this. This was, if you like, the image of power. When I was a child and a young man, power was, middle-aged to elderly. Power wore glasses. Power was nearly always bald or balding. Power was always white. Weirdly, this should make me feel much more powerful at this stage in my life than it actually does. But this is a ubiquitous image of power. This is a ubiquitous way of presenting power. It used to be, people might say this used to be much more ubiquitous. You know, here's Neville Chamberlain's cabinet of 1939. Look at that. They really are pretty similar to one another. But disturbingly, here's the front bench in about 2011. And, you know, I don't even know where to begin with that. It's not unique to the West. Here's the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, and here is the Russian cabinet. We really are looking at something which has pervaded not only Western European, but world political cultures over the last century at least. The question of how power is conveyed is another reason why looking at things is a useful activity, because when you go to a museum, everything you see has a number of things in common. In fact, every object in every museum anywhere in the world has a number of things in common with every other object in every other museum everywhere in the world. I mean, things like the fact that things in museums have been decontextualized. They are no longer where they're supposed to be. Which also means that they have been recontextualized. They've been given meaning and interpretation by their curators. So those two things they have in common. The other thing that they have in common is they've all survived. They are all that fraction of a fraction of a fraction of 1% of the material output of the world which has made it this far. Even modern and contemporary art, the world is littered with modern art that never made it to a museum. We've all seen things that we thought, oh, that would look nice at home, but I'm not going to buy it. No one's bought it. I tell you, it's gone back to the studio of the artist. These things that survive tell us something because of the fact of their survival. Things survive for a number of reasons. By accident, because they've been forgotten in the back of a cupboard. They survive because people value them for some reason, because of who made them, or because of the stuff that they're made of. Or they survive because they are of something which is of value to people. They represent something, they show something which is of value. This is an example of that. This is a print of this woman, Nur Jahan. Nur Jahan was the wife and consort of the Mughal Emperor of India, Jahangir Khan, and she was an extraordinarily powerful woman. She was his last and most powerful wife. And after his death, she ruled as regent alongside her son. She was an object of fascination to Westerners because in a culture where they didn't see women of power, she was one. And she was not entirely hidden from them. They knew that she was operating. Those first Western Europeans who established businesses and eventually colonial dynasties in India, they knew of her. This is an interesting image. Here she is, frankly, lounging with her ladies in this lovely garden under this lovely canopy. It's interesting to compare that with this image, which is an Indian image, as you can see, and in all likelihood made during her lifetime. In this one, Nur Jahan is active. She is in dialogue. She is working. She is dealing with, in this case, her son. She is pulling the reins of power. This version, this Indian version of this woman, is very different from the colonial version, which is infected by all those ideas about what women are, about what Indians were, about this strange country to which the Dutch had just come. All those things have gone into the making of this image of Nur Jahan, which is so different from this image of Nur Jahan. These things that survive are able to tell us not just about their subjects, but about the people for whom they were intended. Looking carefully at things tells you about audiences as well as about the object and its maker. Makers are very important. This painting by Titian in the Ashmolean is case in point. This is Giacomo Doria. You know that because I wrote it down for you. Giacomo Doria, he's a Genoese diplomat. He's a son of one of the greatest Genoese aristocratic families, and he spends his life in diplomatic missions and trade missions to Venice, amongst other places, the courts of Northern Europe. And he has this painting made while he's in Venice by Titian, the greatest portrait painter of his age, perhaps the greatest portrait painter of any age. It's interesting, you think about what's in the picture. What we've got a big column. We've got a man. He's dressed in black. He has a beard. The end. There's nothing here. It doesn't identify him very clearly. There's an inscription over here on the column. But really what it's about is this. It's about Titian and his capacity to tell you something about this man in the way he looks at you. There are other clues. The fact that he's dressed in black, this sumptuous fabric, is a signifier of wealth, but it's a very straightforward signifier of wealth. Really what's interesting are his eyes and his face. I mean, it's a miracle that Titian even bothered with his hands. And yet, this tells you a great deal about him. The way he looks at you, the way he presents himself, the confidence of his stance. This painting hangs just along the wall from it by another Venetian painter of a slightly later generation. And this is of a Venetian diplomat, a man very comparable to Doria, a member of a Venetian aristocratic family who spends his life on diplomatic and trade missions in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Levant. And this painting tells you a lot about him. He's wearing the robes of a Venetian aristocrat. He likes old world buildings, just like Doria, but he also wants to tell you where he's been. Here is this kind of distant port city with a boat, with towers. He likes to tell you what he does. He's very interested in books and scholarship. He likes to tell you about his taste. This Turkey rug over the table is an example of both wealth and discerning taste. There's a great deal more to know about Sagredo in this painting than there is about Doria, and yet if you look here, he's a cipher. I don't know what you see in him, but I don't see the same kind of penetrating intelligence or strength that I see in Doria. Now, that's not to say that Sagredo was not an equally astute businessman and diplomat, but what it is to say is that the difference between these two images is that this one was made by somebody great, and this one was made by somebody pretty good. You don't need as much in this one as in this one, because Titian is capable of telling you what you need to know about Doria without the props. You know, he goes into the studio, he doesn't need the book, he doesn't need the uniform, and he doesn't need the rug on the table. What he needs is Titian to do this. You look carefully at objects, you begin to see the differences between them, you begin to distinguish between things. You begin to understand the motivation for their making as well. The motivation for the making of those things, in all likelihood, these were intended to hang in some family residence, and they were to tell the family about the person. The motivation for making portraits is very often along those lines, and somewhere along the way is a little admixture of self-aggrandizement and vanity. Much harder to tell the motivation of the manufacture of something like this, except I probably need to hit something or cut something, so I will batter this stone until it's an appropriate shape. This is a fabulous thing. You have it in your hand, and it weighs the right amount. It balances in your hand, but not the same in each hand. If you look at this diagram of it, you can see that it has a twist in it. It's not flat, it turns. And that's the result of an extraordinarily careful and clever napping process. Such that if you put it in your left hand, it feels entirely different from if you put it in your right hand. And I will tell you, and I will guarantee this is the case, that this was made for a right-handed person. That the motivation for the manufacture of this, as it is manufactured, is not aesthetic, but practical. That here you have something which, it is a thing of beauty, but its intention is not to be beautiful. Its intention is to be useful. And it's more useful for a right-handed person than it is for a left. You don't know that until you start to look as carefully as you can. These two, very similar, axe heads from a later period. These are some tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years later than that first hand axe we looked at, are an interesting case. This one is part of a group of jadeite hand axes which we know were manufactured from stone taken from only two sites in Europe. One of them is a kind of boulder in the Alps to the north and the east of Turin. And there's an archaeologist who spent many years searching for the site of this particular kind of jadeite, because these axes have been found in a line that stretches from northern Scotland right down to Sicily, all across Europe. Never large numbers of them, single finds in individual places, but there are a lot of them. They're never particularly worn. These are not axes that have been used for chopping much, but they are exquisitely finished. The suggestion, therefore, is that they have some other purpose, some kind of ritual purpose, which goes beyond their useful function for hitting and chopping. It's interesting then to consider this one, which in form and in colour is very similar to the jadeite one, but which is made of a very different stone, this greenstone from Langdale in the Lake District in the north of England. Is a stone which is capable of taking a polish like this, but is in fact, when you see it, a distinctly unpromising kind of rock. Nonetheless, a factory has been found for the manufacture of these things, a cave in Langdale, where blanks for the manufacture of the smooth versions have been located, and some of the smooth versions. And it seems likely that in the absence of these things, someone was making them in a similar colour, such that they could serve the same, whatever it was, ritual function, ritual purpose, as these ones. When you start to look closely and you consider not just form, but things as simple as colour, things as straightforward as whether or not the blade has been used, and then you set those things against what we know about the objects, you begin to understand them better. That coincidence of knowledge and observation is what I urge my students to find when they look at objects. This is the most useful object in the Ashmolean. I use this in teaching all the time. It's a fabulous thing. It doesn't have three lids. I've just photographed it from different angles. Clever. It has two inscriptions on it. It has two kind of winged figures, angels in roundels, and it has this this cylindrical container. It's a pyx. It's for holding the host, the communion, the body of Christ. And if you look carefully at it and you ask yourself what's it made of, these are some of the answers that you'll get. It's made of copper, but also gold, glass, cobalt, mercury, tin, iron sulfate, alum, lead, cinnabar, zinc, and wood. You might say, why is there wood in there? Well, there's wood because in order to make this, you need to make a fire. And you can't do that unless you start off with some wood. This thing is more complex than it appears to be. What we can tell about it then, from looking at it carefully, are these various things. We can say something about its manufacture. We can follow the lines, the joints on it. We can see where these pieces are riveted on. We can say something about the techniques used to make it, about the way in which the pattern has been carved out and then the reserves filled with enamel. We can say something about devotional practice. So we can say something about faith. We say something about its physical history, about what's happened to it over the 800 years or so since it was made. We can say something about whether it's a unique object or part of a group, because we can compare it with others. We can say something about the routes on which it travelled, because we're able to determine from the materials where it was made. We can say something about style at the time of its making. We can say something about people's interests in things like this over time, because clearly there was a time when this didn't matter, because that's when it got broken. We can say something beyond that about value, and we can say something about iconography, about what it means to use those inscriptions and those angels. And those areas of inquiry, which we determine by looking at the thing, make this of interest to all sorts of people. So these are some of the people that I've taught with this subject. Neuroscientists, art historians, theologians, classicists, psychiatrists, historians of science, GPs, business people, Italianists, geographers, historians, English people, Germanists you might add to that list. This speaks to each of them in a different way, because the historian might be interested in trade routes or collecting history, the economic historian in value, the theologian in the iconography, the geographer in the materials and their sources. And this is something which you can apply more widely. This is a stirrup. This is a conquistador stirrup. It's in the collection of the Art Museum of the University of Wyoming in Laramie, Wyoming, which is a real place. I know this because I have been there and I have worked with this stirrup. The University of Wyoming is a remarkable institution, full-on research university in the middle of literally nowhere. If you go out of Laramie to the west, Laramie's a town of 30,000 people. You go out to the west, it's 500 miles before you get to another town of comparable size. These are some of the people with whom I've had discussions surrounding this stirrup for exactly the same reasons and exactly the same way as I've had conversations around the pyx. Because once you look at it and you break it down and you understand it not simply as a whole object but also as a collection of parts, as a collection of materials, as a record of physical history, it becomes more than just a conquistador stirrup that you might find on eBay. It becomes a great deal more. The same is true of images. These two Lucas van Leyden engravings. Obviously interesting to doctors, because here's a doctor and here's a dentist. The doctors look at the doctor and go, ooh, ow, that looks sharp. And then they look at the dentist and they say, well, he's not really a doctor, so why are we looking at that? The reason we're looking at that is because this tells us something about the way in which doctors and medical practitioners have been perceived. This print shows us a dentist attending to the mouth of his patient while his dental hygienist robs them. 'Twas ever thus. There is here the seeds of a very fundamental view of the medical profession that persists in Europe over hundreds of years. That is to say, alongside those serious doctors that we treat with due respect and reverence, we are suspicious of quacks, and the representation of the quack is right here. Here's an image of St. Catherine exchanging her heart with Christ. Or, to use the title which is on the back of this image, St. Catherine receiving back her heart from Christ after it has been cleansed. Now, this is a wonderful image if you're interested in the story of St. Catherine of Siena. But it's also an interesting image if you're interested in transplant surgery. Because here's Jesus doing just that. And that sounds trite. But if medical practitioners want to talk about transplant surgery, about what it means to bring somebody back to life, then something like this is a useful place to start the conversation. Similarly with psychiatrists, if you want to think about how you approach an elderly depressed patient, then looking at an image like this is a useful place to start. I was with some psychiatrists yesterday, and I'm often with psychiatrists. You'll probably think that's a very good thing. But looking at this with old age psychiatrists, the questions that came up in the conversation were not about Rembrandt, were not about his father, were not about the way in which this thing is made. They were questions about how do you position yourself when you have a patient slumped in a chair. Do you sit at the same level as them? Do you stand? Do you sit behind the desk? Do you come round onto their side? How do you approach them physically is the question which came up in relation to this. Similarly, the question in relation to this wonderful drawing by Michelangelo was about how grief is expressed, and the experience of grief was something which the group of psychiatrists that I looked at this drawing at alongside was so various. Their experience of its manifestation, not only amongst their patients but their patients' relatives, was so extreme in some cases that this acted as a good anchor for a conversation which had nothing to do with Michelangelo. Looking at things is useful. I don't want to talk about this really. This is a silver bowl. It's got some Roman coins in it, but they're not real Roman coins. They're casts of Roman coins. So it's a fake, but it's not a fake because it was actually made by somebody who had access to the Roman coins. We know this because there are casts of the same coin more than once in this. So clearly they were making them. It's an object which led to a small exhibition in the Ashmolean, which touched on religious history, economic history, political history, military history, and technological history. And finally, this strange little bronze woman. That background of that's a notebook exactly like this. So you can tell the scale of her, she's like that. She turned up in a sale and was bought by a dealer who thought that she looked faintly interesting, and I was party to some of the research that went on to determine what she was. And it involved looking at lots of bronze things of a similar apparent age, which is about 1,000 years. Here she is in a better image. We determined that she was Mary Magdalene. She's carrying this kind of pot. And then, not I, sadly, but somebody observed that on the doors of this church, San Zeno in Verona, there is a narrative scene in which the three Marys visit the tomb of Christ on Easter morning to find the tomb occupied by an angel, the grave clothes lying on the slab, and the angel telling them that Christ has gone. Not only has Christ gone, but so too has Mary. Not anymore. This was the result of starting off by looking carefully at her, looking as carefully as we could, and then thinking, where have we seen something like that? This takes us back to the fundamental business of being an art historian, which is very often, without wishing to be too trite, well, this looks like that. Where does that take me? Now, for an art historian, it might take you to this, but for everybody else, it takes you in any number of directions. Looking carefully at things helps you to understand the thing itself, its maker, its audience, the reason why it is on display, its relationship to other objects on display, its place in the great story of making, in which the whole of human culture is involved. We've been looking here principally at objects from the Western tradition because that's essentially what I look at. You go to the Ashmolean, you'll find those things set alongside things from other traditions. And you'll begin to realise that there are coincidences of intent, coincidences of manufacture and technique, coincidences of meaning, which we can read between objects. But we can only do it if we look closely. So if there is an answer to the question about why is it worth looking at things, it's because when we look at things we find meaning, and without meaning, oh, well, really, what are we? It's like that thing in The Simpsons. You know, comic book guy in The Simpsons? Anyone? There's a great scene where he's walking along the pavement, reading a comic, and a nuclear missile is coming towards him like this. And he looks up and goes, "Oh, I've wasted my life." You look carefully at things, you're not wasting your life. You look carefully at things, you are finding out about it. And that is the end. Thank you very much for your patience. Okay, I've talked for so long that happily there's almost no time for questions, but there is time for questions. So if anybody wants to ask anything, if anyone wants to tell me that I've told you a lie, if anyone wants to point out something that I haven't yet noticed, then fire away, because I'd be interested to know what you think. Go ahead.
When you say for us to look at things in our own way, but what influence would say you as a curator now have on us by where you position that object in the room,
Yeah.
the colour of the room?
Yeah, enormous influence, and this is why I made the point about all objects in museums having been interpreted, having been recontextualised and given meaning not only by themselves but by their curatorial context. And I think you have to bear that in mind whenever you're in a museum, is that you're seeing what the curator wants you to see. They've A, chosen the objects from the collection, they have B, painted the room a particular colour, and they've C, decided to put this thing alongside that thing and not that thing. And then furthermore, they've written something which tells you what they want you to know. Now that determination about what's important to know will vary in time. Years ago, you might have gone into a museum and you'd be lucky to get the name and the date of the painting. Now you'd be lucky to get away without being told the name of the man who used to deliver milk to the person in the picture. So levels of interpretation vary wildly. But yes, you have to be aware when you look that you separate your own looking from the looking that's already been done for you. What we tend to do when we go to museums is use the looking that's been done for us and rely on that. My manifesto, if you like, is ignore it. Ignore it. Look at the thing. Go to a museum and look at one object, and then go away again, and then think about it, and then go back. You can do that because museums here are free. It's great. I was in New York last week. I have this card from the United Nations, which lets me get into museums for free, but I have to pay for it every year. And I paid for it in 3 days in New York, just because it costs the earth, which means that people go to museums and they think they have to look at everything because they've just shelled out $25 to be there. The privilege of being in museums that charge you nothing is not that you have access to 1 million objects, it's that you have access to one object whenever you feel like it. That's the privilege. And that's why looking is important, because if you go to a museum and you feel compelled to see everything, you don't see anything. If you go to a museum and you are at liberty to see whatever you want, then you can look. That's my other manifesto, by the way. I'm full of manifestos. Any more? Any more? Yeah, go ahead.
You said that art also tells you a lot about the audience.
Yeah.
If you look at the abstract modern art like Judd,
Mhm.
what does it say about the audience?
Well, it says something interesting, that we want to gather a group of those works into a room and that it will be full of people wandering around, scratching their chins, going,
But that happens to you.
So that, it tells us that we seek meaning in things which are apparently and intentionally devoid of meaning. And that's an interesting commentary on contemporary culture. I'm not one of those people who says that the absence of meaning in modern art indicates an absence of meaning in our contemporary lives. I think that's a lot of old nonsense. But it is interesting that objects of such apparent blankness nonetheless speak sufficiently that people pay millions of dollars for them and gather them in museums and worship at them as if they were shrines. So that does tell us something about the audience, even though the object itself is apparently blank. Yeah.
If you could meet any artist, who would you like to meet?
Donatello. Donatello. Donato di Niccolo di Bettobardi, 1386 to 1466. He's the greatest artist in any medium, anywhere, at any time, who ever lived. And I will fight anyone who says he's not. Donatello is the subject of my PhD, and I genuinely believe that there is no greater sculptor who's ever lived. I think it's difficult comparing a painter with a sculptor, but there's no greater sculptor. And people say, oh, Michelangelo. And people always say Michelangelo, and they always say it like that, oh, Michelangelo. The fact is, no Donatello, no Michelangelo. But there's no one prior to Donatello on whom he relies in the same way. He's the most remarkable artist. And also, if you read Vasari, and you believe Vasari, and we must believe Vasari more than people have taught us to, because there came a point in Vasari studies when everybody said, oh, Vasari is just stories that he's made up, lies that he's heard from someone. In fact, actually, Vasari probably more historically reliable than we give him credit for. If you read Vasari about Donatello, he's a nice bloke. He hangs a money bag in the middle of his studio, so if any of his assistants need some money, they just go to the bag and they take some. He goes to visit some nuns at a convent in Padua, and he finds a little piece of marble in the garden, and he knocks off a little relief Virgin and Child for them. Cosimo de' Medici gives him robes because he wants to honour him, because Cosimo uses him a great deal and Donatello won't wear them. He says, robes. He goes to the doctor, and in order to honour the doctor, to pay the doctor, he gives him a little bronze roundel of the Virgin and Child, which is on the back a negative of the relief on the front, such that you can cast the front in glass by using the back as a mould. It's the cleverest object you'll ever see. It's in the V&A. And he gives that to his doctor. is worth so much more than the treatment, but it's a gift of honour. So yeah, Donatello, I'd be down the pub with him right now if I could be. Next, yes.
Thank you very much for your answer. You talk about the coincidence of knowledge and observation.
Mhm.
And I feel I have certain powers of observation, although it's not a muscle I exercise,
Mhm.
but I completely lack knowledge.
Mhm.
So to what extent is my taking away meaning dependent on improving the knowledge?
Ah. There is a necessary kind of confluence of the two at some point. But what I would say is that if you have a little knowledge, if the museum gives you a little knowledge of something, one of the things that looking does for you is it enables you to understand why that knowledge is that knowledge. So you look at something carefully. You think about, well, why do they say it's this, a pyx? You know, they might tell you what a pyx is. It's a container for the host. You look at the thing and you say, well, what about this object tells me that it performs that function? So they've told you something about it, but you can, if you like, dig into that knowledge through observation. So I think that in the case of the pyx, you might focus on the inscriptions. You might not know what the inscriptions are, but you might guess that they have something to do with something else. They're actually inscriptions which are monograms we see in churches all the time. So very often for my students, they don't know what it says, but they know they've seen it somewhere. So I would say that you're not at a loss if you're entirely without knowledge. If you have a little knowledge, then allied to your observations, it becomes a great deal more. So the two have to go hand in hand. But that's not to say you can't go somewhere and see things that you are entirely unfamiliar with and still find it rewarding, because you will find things out by looking which the curators will not tell you anyway. Yeah.
Sort of along the same lines, I was thinking about the Psalms on Monday that was and my brother is in the art world and he showed me a photo of it in 2005.
Yeah, when it was still knackered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, how much more valuable would it be if you sort of had to do like blind tastings in art galleries where there were no insignia at all?
Okay, so
Go around
take the labels out.
Not knowing anything, and then go back with the labels on. Because so many times you go and see something and you go, oh, but it's a Da Vinci, therefore I must.
Yeah, I've got to go and see that one.
Or I must pay,
Yeah.
$5 billion for it.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, the museums have experimented with the label-free space, and it is an interesting experiment because people don't always go to the Leonardo. They don't always go to the Michelangelo, but blind tasting. See, I've been talking here it's been all about looking and not about reading the labels. What the label does is what I was just talking about there, which is to say it provides you with an anchor point for your looking. So you don't go away thinking on the basis of what you've seen that this thing was made 5 minutes ago in Hong Kong. You go away with some sense, at least of its point of origin, perhaps. Everything else that you want to know about it, you can rely on yourself for. But I think having something to anchor yourself is useful for most people, largely because art is still one of those things that, I mean, what's the terrible old saying, I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. That's, it's good to know what you like, but it's also good to know something to go alongside that, because then you begin to be able to make judgments. And I'm not afraid of value judgments, nor am I afraid of anybody making value judgments on art. I think people should. I think people should express taste, should express preference. If we do that solely on the basis of what we know, then it strikes me as a shame. But if we do it on the basis of what we know and what we see, then I think we become better people. Because I think that extends out into other arenas of personal, private and public interaction. Anything else?
Well, if I may.
Please.
Thank you for showing us these things through your gaze, Jim. It's a privilege to look through your eyes for an hour, and a great satisfaction to know that someone like you is in our community. Thank you all for being here and for sharing in this experience. Do come back for our next event. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
You're all very welcome.